Welcome back, Beyond the New and all that jazz. It's time to talk about the books that I read in the month of March. And let's just rip off this band-aid, shall we? March was the definition of meh. So, I did not read as much as I usually do. Katya. Okay, the whiny princess is here. So, I did not read as much as I usually do. I did not like the books that I read as much as I usually do. It was just very mid. And so let's just get right into it, shall we? So first off, just some stats. I ended up reading 6 books in March, which was a total of 3,548 pages, of which a lot of that was also immersion reading to help my brain focus, because this is stress-filled time finishing up my thesis, thinking about jobs that I'm going to apply to, getting my resume ready, it's just a lot. So yeah, 2 of those 6 books were rereads, and 2 of them had what I would consider diversity, or either the author is not like me, or there was some good LGBT rep, or what have you. And all 6 books were full-length novels, so it ended up being an average rating of 3.88 stars. So that just gives you an idea. I gave a lot of 3 stars. Nothing was more than 4.25 stars this month. It was all 4 stars or less, which, yeah. And I don't know if some of that is just my brain space because I'm stressed and just crankier than usual, or if it's just these books were more mid than usual. Who knows? But as usual, we will go in ascending star order. We'll start with my least favorite read of the month, and then we'll go to my most favorite read of the month. I mean, at least the good thing about it being mid is I didn't have any books that I hated. So at least there's that. So the first book that I'll talk about is Empire of Silence by Christopher Ruocchio. This is book 1 in the Sun Eater series, saga, whatever. And I gave it 3.5 stars. And here's the deal. Empire of Silence is very much that classic setup of somebody telling you their life story, which I don't mind. But I think I'm having more of a challenge with that type of story if I don't get multiple timelines. If I'm not jumping back and forth between the past and present, then I find it a little bit more boring. And so this one, we literally are following this child perspective of Hadrian and how he gets to a different planet and the trials and tribulations that he goes through. And eventually there is this alien mystery plotline, but that doesn't kick in until 2/3 of the way through this book. And so for the first 2/3, it is very much a coming of age-ish tale. And I just was not that gripped by it. This was not the moment that I needed that kind of story. And I think that I haven't heard many people talking about it, but Empire of Silence really proudly wears its Dune inspirations on its sleeve. There's even a quote where it's fear is the death of reason or something, which is obviously an homage to Fear is the Mind Killer. So it just felt like something I had read before, but I did get really intrigued by the alien plotline at the end. So maybe I'll try book 2 at some point. I'm not in any huge rush for it, but the alien stuff was interesting enough and people loved this series enough that I'll definitely probably give book 2 a try at some point. But Empire of Silence was one of those books where I was people scream about this series from the rooftops, but so far it's basically Dune. And so maybe people who love Dune love this. I'm not totally sure. So if you are obsessed and you think that Empire of Silence is the best book in this series and you've read it, let's talk. I'm just curious, what about it resonated with you so much? But anywho, moving on to the next book, I had 2 3.75 star reads. So the first one that I will talk about is Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare. This is book 1 in the Dark Artifices, which is the 3rd series in her larger Shadowhunters world, because we have the Mortal Instruments, then we have the Infernal Devices, and now we have the Dark Artifices, which is more of a direct sequel to the Mortal Instruments timeline-wise. And it was fine. I found the main couple kind of annoying. I wasn't really rooting for them and their dynamics. And there was one queer character, and he ended up kind of falling into stereotypes of how queer characters are portrayed in media that I did not love. But as per usual, Cassandra Clare's stuff is just very fun and easy to read. It's very much like reading CW dramas in book form. And so I still had fun with it, but I had a lot of complaints about it as well. And then the next thing, so this is where people are going to get out their pitchforks for me. I gave Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erikson, book 1 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, 3.75 stars. And here's why. I do not love the way of world building that he does, where we get little drips and dribbles of world building only in character dialogue. It felt like if you've ever played like a FromSoft game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring or any of those, you'll know like the cryptic conversations that you have with NPCs, but then a lot of the world building is done in item descriptions. So it felt like all of the world building that I would have gotten in item descriptions was lost. And I'm only getting this kind of cryptic conversation between characters. And so like I never really felt like I had enough information for things to be as impactful as I wanted them to be. And so just like that's a personal preference thing. Like if you really like cryptic conversations and looking through every word the characters say to each other, trying to parse out what's going on, then you will love Gardens of the Moon. But that's just not my favorite way of getting world building. And at the same time, like we were crushing so much into this first book that I feel like the characters never really got time to breathe either. So like I never was really attached to characters, and there were some pretty dramatic things that happened to characters, but I never was like emotionally gut punched by it because it was all just like so quick. But I will say, with all of that being said, I loved the like magic forward nature of the story. Like there is off the walls epic nonsense of the magic, and I ate it up. And I think it was also an interesting reading experience because like everybody, when you hear Malazan, people always talk about like, oh, it's so dense, it's so confusing, it's so blah, it's so blah. And I think because I am so well read in Dungeons and Dragons, like I've read hundreds of books, like I could immediately pick up all of the little parts that were inspired by different aspects of Dungeons and Dragons. And I didn't know going into this book that the Malazan universe was originally their Dungeons and Dragons campaign setting. And so I was like, oh, the Tista Andi with their floating castle and all their shadow magic is the Netherese from Forgotten Realms. They also do shadow magic. They float around in a castle. Like it was literally like one for one. And so I think because of that, like I was able to pick up on the world building and a lot of that stuff a lot more easily and was able to focus more on the actual plot and the political dynamics of Gardens of the Moon. So I wasn't as lost as I think many people are, but it was a fun time. So if you're interested in like the epic of all epic magic, then I think Gardens of the Moon is worth giving a try. I do hear that future books get longer, more philosophical, and more like kind of ornately written. And so I'm sure that as I get to those, I'll hit those more dense spots that take me longer to get through. But so far, like I'm intrigued enough to continue, but I'm not head over heels in love yet. So hopefully you don't cancel me for not loving Gardens of the Moon. Then the next thing I'll talk about, my first 4-star read was Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Margaret, Weis, and Tracy Hickman. This is book 1 in the Dragonlance Chronicles, the original trilogy of Dragonlance. And this is just so much fun. This is very classic adventure fantasy, but instead of following like small town like shepherd boy who goes off, we are following a group of friends who split off and went their own separate ways for many years and now are coming back together. And as they're coming back together, they get embroiled in this worldwide plot. And it is very classic. We have elves, dwarves, half-elves, etc. We have mages that are doing the Dungeons and Dragons casting with their components and verbal parts to do their magic. And so it was just so much fun being back in this world, and I can't wait to continue. I was supposed to read Dragons of Winter Night, did not get to it, hoping to squeeze that in along with book 3, Dragons of Spring Dawning, in April, but we'll see. And then my next 4-star read was my reread of Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I think I just was not as in the mood for more slow-paced political fantasy at this moment in time. I do love where Elantris goes. I love the magic system. I think it's interesting reading this in hindsight now that I've read everything else in the Cosmere, kind of looking at how it all started. But it's just not my favorite kind of story. It is very slow-paced. The characters aren't my favorites. I enjoy them, but they're not my favorite. So it's just... And I think this one really may be a casualty of my mood because I remember enjoying Elantris a lot more the first time I read it. So, oops. And then the last thing that I'll talk about, which ended up as kind of de facto my favorite of the month, but it was still only a 4.25 star read, and that was The Ruin of Kings by Jenn Lyons. This is another very D&D inspired feeling world. We have my favorite trope of all, the Gods Among Us trope, and I had a lot of fun with that. My major complaint is the gimmicky narrative structure that Jenn Lyons employs in this story. Basically, our main character is in prison, and his jailer is kind of getting him to tell his life story, but she is also telepathic, and so she decides, no, I don't like where you're telling your life story from, so he's telling like more recent to how he ended up in jail, and she decides to go back further and talk about a child and how he ended up getting into those events that precipitated him ending up in jail. And so literally every chapter we're jumping back and forth in the timeline, and that just drove me up a wall because it was very much like every chapter would end in a cliffhanger and then we would jump back or forward in time and then we would go back and forth and back and forth. And if it had been split into parts, like I don't know, maybe 4 parts where we did like early, then current, then early, then current, I would have liked it a lot more. And I did like it a lot more when we both storylines kind of met up at current day and we continued from there in part 2 of this book. I had a lot more fun with that. But when I was in the individual timelines, everything that was happening was a lot of fun. The earlier timeline was a lot of political maneuvering and stuff like that. And the secondary timeline was just off the walls, crazy gods among us, just mess, and I loved it. So that's how it ended up at a 4.25 stars. It's just that gimmicky narrative structure. Like, I did not vibe with that. I'm still definitely continuing the Chorus of Dragons series, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. I do know Angela was telling me from Literature Science Alliance, because this is one of her favorite series, that book 2 I think still has a semi-gimmicky narrative structure, then book 3 won't. And so I'm going to try at least the first 3 books, but we all know I'm horrible at DNFing, so if I read 3 books, I'm just going to read all 5. Let's face it. But yeah, that was my reading in March. It was very much fine. Which is unfortunate for me, but it is what it is. Please, in the comments down below, let me know your favorite read from March. And if you just want to leave an emoji to let me know that you were here, maybe leave a moon for Gardens of the Moon, because I've been putting off that book for so long and I finally read it. So yeah, leave me some kind of moony emoji. And other than that, please like this video if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already for more bookish shenanigans like this from moi. Other than that, we hope you have a good rest of your day and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye!